The gleaming towers of Manhattan's financial district cast long shadows across the bustling streets below. But inside the marble-lined corridors of Blackstone Capital Management, Alexander Hartwell commanded attention with the quiet confidence of a man who had turned millions into billions. At 35, he possessed the sharp intellect and ruthless precision that had built his empire. Yet beneath the tailored suits and calculated decisions lived a man who had forgotten what it meant to feel truly alive. His penthouse office overlooked a world he owned but never touched, filled with people who respected his wealth but had never known his heart. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening in late September, when the autumn air carried the first hints of winter's approach. Alexander had been working late again, reviewing acquisition documents that would expand his holdings into the European markets, when his assistant reminded him of the charity gala he was expected to attend. These events were business obligations rather than pleasures, opportunities to network with other wealthy donors while maintaining the public image his board of directors insisted upon. He climbed into his black Mercedes, his mind already calculating the minimum appearance time required before he could return to his work. The intersection of Park Avenue and 42nd Street had seen thousands of uneventful crossings that day, but as Alexander's driver navigated through the evening traffic, a delivery truck ran the red light at full speed. The impact sent the luxury sedan spinning across 3 lanes of traffic before it crashed into the concrete barrier separating the roadway from the sidewalk. In those brief, violent seconds, the carefully constructed world of Alexander Hartwell shattered like glass, taking with it not just his physical well-being, but the memories that defined who he had believed himself to be. Hannah Fraser had been working the night shift at St. Vincent's Hospital for 3 years, ever since she had moved to New York from her small hometown in Ohio, with dreams of saving enough money to return to nursing school. The emergency room rarely surprised her anymore, but when the paramedics wheeled in the unconscious man from the Mercedes crash, something about his peaceful expression amid the chaos caught her attention. His expensive clothes were torn and bloodied, his face bearing the cuts and bruises of the impact, yet even unconscious, he seemed to carry himself with a dignity that spoke of a life lived with purpose, though she couldn't have imagined the extent of that purpose. The doctors explained the severity of his injuries with clinical detachment: traumatic brain injury resulting in retrograde amnesia, likely permanent, affecting memories spanning the previous 15 years. When Alexander finally opened his eyes a week later, he looked around the sterile hospital room with the confused wonder of a child, unable to recognize his own reflection in the mirror, or understand why strangers in expensive suits kept visiting to discuss business matters that meant nothing to him. The man who had once controlled vast financial empires now struggled to remember his own name, and the lawyers and executives who had once sought his approval became sources of overwhelming anxiety. Hannah found herself assigned to his care during the long night shifts, when the hospital grew quiet and the parade of business associates finally ceased their visits. She had dealt with amnesia patients before, but Alexander's case struck her as particularly tragic. The visitors spoke of his accomplishments, his wealth, his importance in the financial world, yet the man she saw bore no resemblance to their descriptions. Instead, she discovered someone who seemed genuinely curious about the simplest things: the way snow looked falling past his window, the sound of her voice reading aloud from the novels she brought from home, the taste of the cafeteria's apple pie that she sometimes smuggled up from the kitchen when he couldn't sleep. In those quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the hospital settled into its night rhythm and the only sounds were the soft beeping of monitors and the distant murmur of traffic outside, Hannah began to see glimpses of the man Alexander might have been before his world became consumed by balance sheets and board meetings. He asked thoughtful questions about her life, her dreams of returning to school, her family back in Ohio who worried about her living alone in the big city. He listened with an attention that seemed completely present, as if her stories were the most important things he had ever heard, and she began to realize that perhaps his accident had not only taken away his memories, but had also freed him from whatever had prevented him from truly connecting with people. The hospital's social worker, Mrs. Richardson, had been trying for weeks to arrange Alexander's discharge, but the process proved complicated by his condition. His business associates wanted to transfer him to a private facility where he could receive what they called appropriate care for someone of his standing. But Alexander himself seemed terrified by the idea of leaving the one place where he felt safe. The expensive rehabilitation centers they described sounded cold and institutional, filled with people who would treat him as a project to be managed rather than a person to be cared for. When Hannah mentioned that she had been considering taking a private nursing position to earn extra money for school, Mrs. Richardson saw an opportunity that could benefit everyone involved. The arrangement, while unconventional, made practical sense. Alexander's apartment, a sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, had been sitting empty since the accident, maintained by a staff who cleaned and organized but provided no companionship. Hannah could live in the guest quarters and provide the round-the-clock care he needed, while earning enough money to finally return to nursing school. His lawyers, eager to have someone responsible overseeing his daily needs, agreed to pay her a generous salary that would cover her tuition and living expenses for the next 2 years. For Hannah, it represented the chance to achieve her dreams while helping someone who genuinely needed her care. Moving into the penthouse felt like stepping into a museum dedicated to a life she couldn't fully comprehend. The walls displayed awards and photographs showing Alexander with presidents, celebrities, and world leaders. Yet the man she wheeled through those halls seemed completely disconnected from that legacy. He showed no interest in the expensive art collection or the library filled with financial journals and business biographies. Instead, he gravitated toward the large windows overlooking the park, spending hours watching the changing seasons and the people below going about their daily lives with a fascination that suggested he had never really noticed such things before. Their daily routine developed naturally around Alexander's needs and limitations. His physical therapy required dedication and patience, and Hannah found herself becoming not just his caregiver, but his cheerleader, encouraging him through the difficult exercises that would help him regain his strength and coordination. They would start each morning with breakfast together in the kitchen, a simple meal that felt more genuine than any of the business lunches he had presumably attended in his previous life. Hannah would read him the news, carefully editing out the financial sections that only seemed to confuse and distress him, focusing instead on human interest stories that sparked his curiosity about the world beyond his apartment. The afternoons were reserved for walks in Central Park when his strength allowed, or for the cooking lessons that had begun almost by accident when Hannah realized Alexander had never learned to prepare even the simplest meals. His previous life had been supported by personal chefs, restaurant meals, and catered events. But now he found genuine joy in learning to crack eggs, chop vegetables, and create something nourishing with his own hands. These moments in the kitchen, with flour on his shirt and concentration furrowing his brow as he followed her instructions, revealed a man capable of patience and attention to detail that served him better in creating a perfect pasta sauce than it ever had in closing million-dollar deals. The evenings became their most treasured time together when they would sit in the living room, and Hannah would continue reading the novels that had become their shared journey through stories of adventure, romance, and human triumph. Alexander had discovered that he loved being read to, that the rhythm of her voice and the unfolding of narratives seemed to calm the anxiety that still sometimes overwhelmed him when he tried too hard to remember his past. She would watch his face as she read, noting how he smiled at moments of humor or grew thoughtful during passages about love and loss, and she began to realize that this man, stripped of his wealth and status, possessed a depth of feeling that had perhaps been buried under years of business obligations. Winter deepened around them, and with it, their connection grew stronger in ways that neither had anticipated. Hannah had always been careful to maintain professional boundaries with her patients, but Alexander's genuine gratitude for her care and his obvious delight in her company made it increasingly difficult to think of him simply as someone she was hired to help. He would light up when she entered a room, not with the entitled expectation of service that she might have expected from someone of his former status, but with the warm appreciation of someone who truly valued her presence in his life. When she caught the flu in January and had to spend several days in bed, his concern for her well-being was so genuine and his attempts to care for her so touching that she began to acknowledge the feelings she had been trying to suppress. The first time Alexander told her he loved her, they were standing in the kitchen, making dinner together, and the words came out so naturally, so free of calculation or artifice, that Hannah felt her heart stop. He had been telling her about a dream he'd had, one of the few that didn't involve trying to remember something he had lost, but instead featured the two of them in a small house with a garden where they grew their own vegetables. The simplicity of the vision, so far removed from the luxury that surrounded them, revealed how completely his values had shifted from his previous life. When she looked into his eyes and saw not the successful businessman everyone else remembered, but the gentle, thoughtful man who had emerged from the accident, she realized that she loved him too, not for who he had been, but for who he was now. Their relationship evolved with the careful tenderness of two people who understood how fragile happiness could be. Hannah continued to maintain her professional responsibilities, ensuring that Alexander received his medications, attended his therapy appointments, and maintained his physical health. But their emotional connection deepened beyond the boundaries of caregiver and patient. They would spend hours talking about their dreams for the future, modest ambitions that focused on meaningful work, simple pleasures, and the kind of quiet contentment that money could not purchase. Alexander spoke of wanting to volunteer at hospitals, to help other patients who were struggling with traumatic injuries, while Hannah shared her plans to specialize in rehabilitation nursing, inspired by her experience caring for him. Spring arrived with an explosion of color in Central Park, and with it came a complication that would test everything they had built together. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a renowned neurologist who specialized in memory recovery, approached Alexander's legal team with news of an experimental treatment that had shown promise in restoring lost memories in patients with similar injuries. The therapy involved a combination of targeted medications, intensive counseling sessions designed to trigger recall, and exposure to significant people and places from the patient's past. The success rate was uncertain, and the process would be difficult, but it offered the possibility of recovering the 15 years that had been lost in the accident. The decision consumed Alexander for weeks, and Hannah found herself in the impossible position of supporting whatever choice he made, while knowing that either path could fundamentally change their relationship. If the treatment failed, they could continue building their life together based on the man he had become. But if it succeeded, there was no guarantee that the Alexander who remembered his previous life would still want the simple existence they had created together. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and lived for the thrill of high-stakes negotiations might find their quiet domestic happiness insufferably dull, and the love they had discovered might become just another casualty of medical intervention. During the consultation with Dr. Hendricks, Hannah sat quietly while the neurologist explained the process in detail. The treatment would require Alexander to spend several weeks in a residential facility where he would be surrounded by reminders of his previous life, photographs, documents, recordings of important business meetings, and visits from colleagues who could provide context for the memories they were trying to restore. The medication would make him more susceptible to emotional triggers, which meant the process would be psychologically demanding and potentially overwhelming. Most challenging of all, there was no way to predict which memories would return or in what order, creating the possibility that he might recover his professional knowledge while losing the emotional growth he had experienced since the accident. Alexander's decision to proceed with the treatment came not from a desire to reclaim his wealth or status, but from a growing sense that he owed it to himself to understand who he had been before making final choices about who he wanted to become. He explained to Hannah that he felt haunted by the gaps in his knowledge, by the sense that he was living in someone else's life without understanding how he had earned the privilege. If the treatment could give him back his memories, he could make an informed decision about whether to return to his previous existence or to continue on the path they had begun together. The weeks of treatment proved as difficult as Dr. Hendricks had predicted. Hannah was allowed to visit only briefly and under strict supervision, watching helplessly as Alexander struggled with fragments of returning memory that often came without context or emotional connection. He would remember closing a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but feel nothing about the accomplishment, or recall attending social events with people whose names he knew, but whose friendships felt hollow and meaningless. The medication made him irritable and confused, and she could see him struggling to reconcile the man he was becoming again with the man he had been during their months together. The breakthrough came during the 6th week of treatment, when Alexander's memories of the 5 years leading up to the accident suddenly returned with startling clarity. With them came the recognition of how empty his life had become, how success had isolated him from meaningful human connection, and how the accident had actually freed him from existence that brought him no real satisfaction. Dr. Hendricks was amazed by his reaction to the recovered memories, noting that most patients felt joy at reclaiming their past, while Alexander seemed almost grieved by what he remembered about the person he had been. When Alexander was finally released from the treatment facility, he returned to the penthouse with full knowledge of his previous life, but also with complete certainty about the life he wanted to live going forward. Hannah had prepared herself for the possibility that he might no longer need her care, that he might choose to return to his business empire and the world of wealth and influence that had once defined him. Instead, she found a man who possessed both the wisdom of experience and the emotional openness that had emerged from his months of recovery. Someone who could remember his past success while choosing a completely different definition of fulfillment. The Alexander who embraced her in the familiar kitchen of the penthouse was neither the ruthless businessman he had once been, nor the confused patient she had first met in the hospital, but rather someone who had integrated both experiences into a more complete version of himself. He remembered the loneliness of his previous life with perfect clarity, which made him treasure even more deeply the love and companionship she had brought into his existence. The memory of boardroom victories that had once seemed so important now paled in comparison to the simple joy of making breakfast together or reading novels aloud on quiet evenings. His decision to gradually divest himself of his business empire surprised everyone except Hannah, who had seen in his eyes the moment he returned from treatment that money and power no longer held any appeal for him. He kept enough assets to ensure their financial security, while donating the majority of his wealth to medical research and charitable organizations focused on brain injury recovery. The penthouse was sold, and they moved to a modest house in a small town outside the city where Hannah could complete her nursing degree at a local college, while Alexander established a foundation to support other amnesia patients and their families. Their wedding took place in the garden behind their new home, a simple ceremony attended by Hannah's family from Ohio and a few of the medical staff who had become friends during Alexander's recovery. Dr. Hendricks served as a witness, marveling at the transformation she had observed in her patient and noting in her research files that Alexander's case had taught her more about the relationship between memory and identity than any textbook could provide. As Alexander slipped the ring onto Hannah's finger, he reflected on how losing his memory had allowed him to find himself, and how meeting her had taught him that the most valuable things in life could not be acquired through business deals or financial success. The foundation they established together became their shared passion, providing support services for brain injury patients and their caregivers while funding research into memory recovery and rehabilitation techniques. Hannah completed her nursing degree and specialized in neurological care, finding that her experience with Alexander had given her unique insights into the emotional needs of patients struggling with similar challenges. Their work brought them into contact with countless families dealing with the aftermath of traumatic injuries, and they found deep satisfaction in helping others navigate the complex journey of recovery and adaptation. Years later, when journalists occasionally tracked down Alexander Hartwell to ask about his dramatic change in lifestyle, he would smile and explain that amnesia had been the greatest gift he had ever received because it had stripped away everything that wasn't essential and allowed him to discover what truly mattered. The interviewer would inevitably ask about his financial empire, his former status as one of the country's most successful businessmen, and he would redirect the conversation to Hannah, to their foundation, to the patients they had helped and the research they had funded. In quiet moments, when Hannah would catch him staring thoughtfully out their bedroom window at the small garden they tended together, she would ask what he was thinking about. Sometimes he would share a recovered memory from his previous life, always with amazement at how different his priorities had been. But more often he would talk about their future plans, the patients they hoped to help, or simply how grateful he felt to wake up each morning next to someone who had seen him at his most vulnerable and chosen to love him anyway. The man who had once measured his worth in quarterly profits and market share now found his greatest achievement in the simple act of being truly known and loved by another person. Hannah had saved his life in ways that went far beyond medical care, teaching him that wealth meant nothing without someone to share it with, that success was meaningless without compassion, and that memory was less important than the capacity to create new experiences filled with genuine connection and purpose. Their story became a legend of sorts in the medical community, a case study in the power of human resilience and the unexpected paths that healing can take. But for Alexander and Hannah, it was simply their life together, built on the foundation of a love that had grown from the ashes of tragedy into something stronger and more beautiful than either had thought possible. They had learned that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what you were truly meant to find, and that the greatest fortune is not what you accumulate, but what you choose to give away in service of something larger than yourself. 5 years into their marriage, an unexpected challenge tested the strength of everything they had built together. Hannah discovered she was pregnant with their first child, news that filled them both with joy until complications arose during the early months. The same hospital where they had first met became the setting for a different kind of vigil, as Hannah faced a difficult pregnancy that required extended bed rest and constant monitoring. Alexander found himself in the unfamiliar role of primary caregiver, a reversal that brought back memories of those early months when Hannah had tended to his every need with such patience and devotion. The irony was not lost on either of them as Alexander learned to prepare the special meals Hannah's condition required, to monitor her medications, and to provide the emotional support she needed during the long, uncertain days. He approached these responsibilities with the same dedication she had once shown him, reading medical journals to better understand her condition, consulting with specialists to ensure she received the best possible care, and maintaining the cheerful optimism that had once hyped him through his own recovery. The experience deepened his understanding of what Hannah had given him during his own healing journey, and he found himself overwhelmed with gratitude for the depth of her sacrifice. During those months of enforced rest, as they waited anxiously for each doctor's appointment that would confirm their baby's continued development, Hannah and Alexander spent countless hours talking about their hopes and fears for parenthood. They discussed how to raise a child with the values they had discovered together, how to teach their son or daughter that true worth came not from material possessions but from kindness, compassion, and service to others. Alexander shared his determination to be the kind of father he wished he had experienced growing up, someone present and emotionally available, rather than consumed by professional ambitions that left no room for family connection. Their son was born on a snowy December morning, arriving 3 weeks early but healthy and strong. With Hannah's dark eyes and Alexander's determined chin, they named him David, after Hannah's grandfather, a man who had worked as a school janitor his entire life, but was remembered by his family as the richest person they had ever known because of his generosity and wisdom. Holding his newborn son in the same hospital where he had once fought for his own life, Alexander felt a completion he had never imagined possible. Understanding finally that this was what success truly looked like, not the accumulation of wealth or the acquisition of power, but the creation of love and the nurturing of life. Parenthood brought new challenges and unexpected joys that further transformed their understanding of what mattered most in life. Alexander discovered that the patience he had learned during his recovery served him well during sleepless nights with a colicky baby, and that the emotional intelligence Hannah had helped him develop made him naturally attuned to their son's needs and moods. They marveled at how David seemed to inherit the best qualities of both parents, Hannah's intuitive compassion and Alexander's focused determination, combined with an innate curiosity about the world that reminded them both of Alexander's wonder during those early months of memory loss. The foundation they had established continued to grow and expand its reach, but now their work took on new meaning as they thought about the world they wanted to leave for their son. They established a scholarship program for children of brain injury patients, recognizing that families often struggled financially during the long recovery periods their loved ones required. Hannah began speaking at medical conferences about the unique perspective caregivers brought to the healing process, while Alexander used his business expertise to help other wealthy individuals establish their own charitable foundations focused on medical research and patient support. Their small town embraced them as integral members of the community, and Alexander found himself serving on the school board and coaching Little League Baseball. Roles that would have seemed impossibly mundane to his former self, but now filled him with purpose and satisfaction. Hannah became known as the nurse who would take emergency calls at any hour, the one who could be counted on to provide both medical expertise and emotional support to families facing medical crises. Their house became a gathering place for neighbors, colleagues, and the extended family of patients they had helped through their foundation work. As David grew from infant to toddler, Alexander began experiencing something he had never felt during his previous life: the desire to slow down time rather than accelerate it. Every milestone, from first steps to first words, seemed precious beyond measure, and he found himself taking photographs constantly, creating the kind of detailed family record he had never bothered to maintain during his business-focused years. He would spend hours playing simple games with David, building block towers and reading picture books with the same intense focus he had once devoted to corporate acquisitions, but now motivated by love rather than ambition. The contrast with his former existence became particularly stark during a chance encounter at a medical conference, where Hannah was presenting her research on caregiver-patient relationships. A former business associate recognized Alexander and approached him with obvious confusion about his transformation. The man, still immersed in the high-pressure world of finance, seemed genuinely bewildered by Alexander's choice to abandon his lucrative career for what he dismissively called playing house and helping sick people. Alexander listened politely to his former colleague's attempts to lure him back into the business world, offering partnerships and investment opportunities that would have excited his younger self. But he felt only pity for someone who still measured worth in terms of market performance and quarterly profits. That evening, as he helped David with a puzzle while Hannah prepared dinner in their modest kitchen, Alexander reflected on how dramatically his definition of achievement had evolved. The puzzle, a simple wooden design featuring farm animals, challenged their 3-year-old son's developing fine motor skills and problem-solving abilities. And watching David's face light up when he successfully placed the cow in its proper spot brought Alexander more satisfaction than closing his largest business deal ever had. He realized that his former colleague had been right about one thing: he was indeed playing house, but that game had turned out to be the most important and rewarding work of his life. The foundation's success began attracting national attention, leading to invitations for Alexander and Hannah to testify before congressional committees about the need for improved support services for brain injury patients and their families. Their testimony, delivered with the authority of both personal experience and professional expertise, helped secure increased funding for research and rehabilitation programs across the country. Standing in the halls of Congress, Alexander felt a different kind of power than he had ever experienced in corporate boardrooms. The influence that came from speaking truth based on genuine compassion rather than self-interest. Their advocacy work brought them into contact with other couples who had faced similar medical crises, and they began hosting annual retreats where brain injury survivors and their caregivers could share experiences, learn from medical experts, and build supportive communities. These gatherings, held at a rustic conference center in the mountains outside their town, became legendary for the healing that occurred when people who had felt isolated by their experiences discovered they were part of a larger community of survivors and heroes. During one particularly meaningful retreat, a young woman approached Hannah to thank her for sharing their story publicly. The woman explained that she had been caring for her husband after a motorcycle accident had left him with severe memory loss, and she had been struggling with guilt about the love she felt for the man he had become, who was so different from the person she had married. Hannah's openness about her own experience had given her permission to embrace this new relationship without feeling she was betraying the past, and she credited their example with saving both her marriage and her sanity. Alexander found himself becoming an informal mentor to other brain injury survivors, particularly those from high-pressure careers who struggled to find meaning in their altered circumstances. His unique perspective, as someone who had experienced both devastating loss and unexpected gain from his accident, allowed him to help others navigate the complex emotions of recovery. He would tell them about the morning he had awakened in the hospital with no memory of his achievements, how terrifying that blank slate had seemed at first, and how gradually he had come to understand it as liberation from a life that had been successful but not fulfilling. As their 10th wedding anniversary approached, Alexander and Hannah began planning a celebration that would honor not just their decade together, but also the community they had built around their shared mission. They decided to host a gala fundraiser for the foundation, but instead of the typical black tie affair his former life might have demanded, they organized a casual outdoor festival where patients, families, medical professionals, and supporters could gather to share food, music, and stories of hope and healing. The day of the celebration dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed for outdoor gatherings. As Alexander watched Hannah organizing volunteers and greeting arriving guests with the same warmth she had once shown him during his most vulnerable moments, he felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this point. Their son David, now a confident 4-year-old, ran through the crowd with the easy familiarity of a child who had grown up surrounded by love and purpose, stopping to hug patients in wheelchairs and offer flowers to visiting medical staff. Dr. Hendricks, now a close family friend, delivered a speech about the unique contribution Alexander and Hannah had made to the field of brain injury recovery. But her words focused less on their professional achievements than on their demonstration that healing involved much more than medical intervention. She spoke about how their love story had become a source of hope for countless patients and families, proof that tragedy could become the foundation for something beautiful and meaningful. As she concluded her remarks, she looked directly at Alexander and said that his case had taught her the most important lesson of her career, that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from remembering what was lost, but from discovering what was always possible. The evening concluded with Alexander and Hannah dancing to the same song they had chosen for their wedding, surrounded by a community that represented the true measure of their success. As they moved together in the soft twilight, with David sleeping peacefully in his grandmother's arms nearby and friends and colleagues chatting quietly around tables laden with simple, delicious food, Alexander thought about how different this celebration was from the corporate events he had once attended. There were no power suits or business cards being exchanged, No deals being negotiated or competitors being assessed. Instead, there was something far more valuable: genuine human connection, shared purpose, and the kind of wealth that could only be accumulated through years of patient investment in the lives and well-being of others.